Hi everyone, this is Sniggles, better known as Sniggeroo. If you're subscribed to our KOTOR, you might know me best as a moderator on the subreddit or as a maintainer of the subreddit mod builds. If not, I'm also part of the administrative staff of Deadly Stream, and I run the Partnered KOTOR Discord server. I've been involved with KOTOR modding for about 8 years now, and I first and last played M478 when it was in its 1.2 release. I know that was before many major quality of life improvements that were made to the mod, so in this section I'll be doing my best to guide you through my views on the concept and execution of the mod's story, world building, and basic structure, rather than touching on content which has likely been improved since my last run through. I also hope to give some insight into the subreddit's typical view of M478, utilizing official survey data that we collected in May of this year, so let's get to it. If you're watching this series, I'm hoping you already have a basic understanding of M478's plot, but for the purpose of this analysis, let's go over the SparkNotes version of the basic premise anyhow. Master Vash, after running into Scion on Korriban, does not die to him there. She takes her Padawan Ka with her to the location of a droid planet called M478, which she identified during her time in captivity. The Sith have convinced the droid protectors of M478 that they were the colonists the droids were waiting for all along, and have used the droids' programmed obedience to whomever they believe to be the intended settlers of the planet to take over the entire colony. It's Master Vash's belief that they've begun to use the planet's immense industrial resources to manufacture additional weapons that will once again make them nigh impossible to defeat, and it was her goal to stop them, as well as attempting to find out any additional information on other Sith factions that the Sith of M478 might possess. But upon the player's arrival at the planet, they find it eerily silent, a radiation leak having killed everyone but the droids in the environmental zone where they landed.
I sense that we may be truly alone on the surface.
The player must rush to stop the deadly radiation, then work through the dual mysteries of what caused the reactor to begin leaking radiation and what happened to Master Vash and her young Padawan. Now, if anyone tells you that doesn't sound like a great setup, they're full of it. Rather than disappointingly finding Master Vash dead on Korriban, you now have the opportunity to meet her and hear her original dialogue, all while solving a murder mystery the scale of an entire planetary district. I know when I heard about it, I was stoked. If it hasn't become clear to you yet, though, I'm not that big a fan of M478. While I have tremendous respect for the amount of work that went into its development, I earnestly believe that the game is better without its restoration, and that's what I want to touch on first by addressing the three main sticking points I think M478's presence causes with the game's overall progression and themes. Its nature as an unskippable planet, the disconnect between M478 and the game's meta-narrative and themes, and M478's complicity in disassociating the events that take place on it from the Sith Triumvirate and the inherent focus of the game upon the Sith Lords. The most significant problem for M478, in my opinion, is that it's a mandatory experience. While that might seem strange to hear, remember that M478 was largely constructed rather than restored. Very little was left in the files that showed Obsidian's original design intentions for the planet, and indeed Master Vash's dialogue is among the very little that remains. Most of M478's structure, narrative, level design, enemy placement, and so on was largely constructed by the mod team, certainly in line with their understanding of Obsidian's original intent, but with extremely limited documentation with which to prove that they were getting it right, unlike in the case of TSLRCM, where the documentation was copious. Allow me to reiterate part of that just one more time. The level design, enemy placement, and basic structure of the mod was largely determined by the team that constructed it. Many of the members of that team have a tremendous amount of experience with games and development, and some of them are professional developers, so it would be remiss to claim that they didn't have the experience to take an earnest shot at creating a seamless and enjoyable mod here. Nevertheless, in a circumstance where the gameplay structure of an entire world is being developed by a team of modders virtually from the ground up, it is, in my opinion, remiss to make the content as constructed entirely mandatory. On the subreddit, we've often had users create threads asking if there's some way for them to skip M478 as they tried it and found that its content wasn't for them, only to discover later that, now having arrived, they must complete the planet in full. In prior versions, such as the 1.2 release which I tested, much of this was a much more practical concern. More limited implementations of fast travel made the mod's frequent use of backtracking significantly more tedious, while lag caused by fog in the industrial zone, which has since been fixed, also led to many wanting to put it down. But the issue, to my mind, is less the underlying rationales behind abandoning the content, and more that there were users who gave it an earnest try, found it wasn't for them, and yet were required to complete it without being able to bypass it. At least not without having knowledge of KSE. For restoration work like you find in TSLRCM, it's no surprise that the content isn't skippable, not just because it was all based on work Obsidian did themselves, but also because the content was spread out in such a manner that even the most long-form and tedious of the restorations hardly lasted long enough to cause any displeasure for the end user. In the case of modded content on the scale of M478, however, adding a backdoor out, even or perhaps especially a story-friendly way out, is in my opinion a common-sense courtesy to the end user. I have good reason to believe that the lack of this alternate way out reduces the chances of users continuing to keep M478 in their builds long term, but I'll touch on that a bit more when I get to the subreddit survey. The quality of life change of allowing M478 to be skipped aside, I think the other largest issue presented in M478 comes from how the planet is integrated into the game's plot and meta-narrative. Put simply, in its current iteration, I just don't think M478 fits seamlessly into the game as it should. It feels more like a structural and design detour from the game rather than the seamless integration that I believe it should, and I think there are several reasons for that. If we ignore all of the mundane ones, like many of the voice actors sounding like they have mics that are just barely better than the one that you hear me recording on right now, I think we can get down to some structural issues. The story M478 portrays, its relevance to the story of the Lost Jedi, and its relationship with the Triumvirs. As you probably know, every planet included in KOTOR 2 has some relationship to war. This isn't surprising, as one of the conceits of KOTOR 2 is to analyze the effects of galaxy-spanning war on people, especially on your companions. From Duxon to Dantooine, everywhere you go was affected in some way by the Mandalorian Wars, the Jedi Civil War, or sometimes both. This is a basic cornerstone of the game's planet design philosophy, and exploring those connections is likewise a cornerstone. Based on what I've just said, you probably know where I'm going with this. M478 has none of that. The closest relationship M478 has to war is that the Sith that arrived to take advantage of it only came to be at all due to the Jedi Civil War, yet that's a second-hand relationship which does little to impact one's impression of the planet, especially since the Sith are already dead to the reactor leak by the time you arrive. Compared to the rest of the game's planets and quests, M478 is a world that is structurally detached, held to the rest of the game's narrative only through two small strands that brought you there, the presence of the Sith and the presence of Vash. But upon arriving and discovering that the Sith are all but gone and Vash is nowhere to be found, even those linkages quickly break down, leaving the player to roam about a disconnected world for several hours, with only brief interruptions of the greater picture when, for example, speaking to Ka. But even these are shallow relations to the game's overarching plot, for both the droids of M478 and Vash herself make it clear to you that the Sith that occupied the colony were not even clearly related to the Triumvirs. Indeed, rather than keeping the actions of Sion, Nihilus, and Traya in focus, Vash's sojourn to M478 increasingly presents itself as a fool's gambit that, while successful in stopping the Sith locally, did absolutely nothing to stall the Lords, or indeed even address the Jedi's ignorance about them or their plans. One could absolutely make the argument that this is poetic in a way, and that Vash is presented as a human in her failing here. Yet the issue is less with what brought Vash and Ka to M478, and more with what you as the player are meant to be seeing and experiencing on the planet, and that experience is one of painful disconnect from the themes and pressing issues of the game's plot as expressed on other worlds. KOTOR 2 is already disappointing in how little it keeps the Lords of the Sith in the spotlight as the principal threat, but M478 disassociates from your quest even further, giving you a planet to spend several hours playing through, which, upon completing, you may well ask, well, what did that do for the galaxy at all? The illusion of urgency which you might find on other worlds, such as Onderon with its civil war or Nar Shaddaa with the refugees, is all but absent on M478, and even a victory there is hollow, providing no clear blow to the Sith, all of them having died before you even arrived there, and precious little benefit to you as the player to justify the time you spent there. If the capture of M478 resulted in fleets of warships being produced for the Republic, the issue might well have been brought home, but aside from shipping some Kolto to Telos, the droid world is both disconnected in its own themes and in the effort it makes to forcibly connect itself to the game's overall plot. Which brings me, finally, to the perspective of the subreddit. Issues with the mod are certainly felt on the sub, even if they aren't necessarily rooted in the same opinions which I've shared with you here. In the May the 4th survey we did earlier this year, we asked questions about the usage of M478, which revealed its lukewarm reception in the broader community. While TSLRCM had a 94.3% usage rate and a rating of 93% in both the categories of mod design and mod gameplay, M478 had only a 38.9% usage rating, with only 27% of respondents that had used the mod saying they used it regularly, and only 10% saying they always used it. If you happen to remember earlier when I mentioned that many people probably don't keep M478 in their builds long term because the content is unskippable, yeah, that's an assumption that I have because it's reflected in the data here. More damningly, 25.5% of users used M478 once but chose to never use it again due to a poor impression of the mod, while 15.9% of users never even tried it at all due to poor word of mouth. M478 also pulled lowest in user reviews, receiving a 57.8% approval rating for its gameplay and a 60% approval rating for the mod's overall design. None of this is to say that M478 is a bad mod, bad project, or the product of a poor effort. The unbelievable amount of work that was put into this experience is evinced by how much it's being talked about still to this day. It was and remains one of the greatest efforts of KOTOR modding the community has ever put out, perhaps even above that of TSLRCM. What I've attempted to suggest here, through my personal impressions and the general usage statistics of the subreddit, is not that this effort was wasted or ill-conceived, but that I believe that the focus of the team was at times misplaced, and design choices limited the success of M478 in the general user base. In closing, it's worth noting that the survey that we held earlier this year was long after the improvements which came with M478 version 1.3, which removed a great deal of the gameplay tedium which might well have caused one to want to put M478 down early prior to its release. Which does suggest, to me anyway, there was something more structural about the mod that just didn't seem to fit together quite right with the rest of the game. Now, there are ways that I believe the M478 team might have been able to not only accentuate this disconnect to the mod's benefit rather than as a thematic detriment, but also make M478 a largely optional experience that would have allowed users to skip the majority of its content at their discretion. Mind that this is just my take on one possible alternate design, but I think it's worth exploring an alternative to see how it might play out. One of the things which KOTOR 2 lacks compared to the original game is a sort of safe hub world like Dantooine was to the party of the first game. This is almost surely an intentional design decision on Obsidian's part, in my view anyway, which was probably intended to enhance the atmosphere of tension and foreboding in the game. But as modded content, M478 didn't need to maintain that perfect divide, especially given that there's already precedent in KOTOR for a safe haven. Rather than being the focus of a great mystery wherein the player is required to attempt to bring M478 back online in order to discover why the Sith were on the planet and in order to find Vash, finding Vash could have instead been accomplished relatively early, with the player dealing with Ka and then finding Vash as one of the first actions undertaken upon arriving at M478. After Vash and Ka's unfortunate deaths due to the dilapidated state of the colony, the mod could then have presented further interactions by the Exile as voluntary, with optional quests designed to improve the state of M478's systems, droids, vendors, and so on. As time passed and more upgrades were made and/or quests were completed on the planet, additional NPCs could have been unlocked, and eventually the player could be named the owner of the colony, perhaps even with their own quarters on a planet, which could then become a safe haven for them. This hypothetical setup does three important things. First, it doesn't invalidate the core elements of M478 that we know for fact, namely that the Sith were present on the planet, Ka did fall to the dark side, and Vash did arrive there pursuing the Sith. All of these would still have occurred. The timetable for the player discovering them would merely be pushed up in this scenario. Second, as mentioned earlier, it would make most of M478's content skippable so that those who find the mod isn't for them could bypass it after discovering its story-critical components, i.e. Vash, rather than being locked into the entire sequence. And finally, it takes advantage of a previously established theme within the series, that of the safe haven, and brings that to KOTOR 2. In my little hypothetical, it even bows to the popularity of another kind of mod for an entirely different kind of game, the personal home. Once more, this isn't to say that I think the team was wrong to design the mod the way they did, and it's quite possible that there are other snippets of known dialogue or sequences which makes their vision more accurate to the original design than what I suggest here. But even if so, with so much of the mod being designed by the team on the ground, as it were, I think concessions could have been made to a design similar to what I suggested, which would have both thematically and structurally improved the experience.